This is the first Dharma talk I've given. So I will discuss the Dharma and also how I came to practice Zen Buddhism. As part of our year of Dogen, I will also talk a little bit about Old Buddha Mind, my assigned fascicle from Dogen Zenji's True Treasury. Treasury of the True Dharma Eye. The Dharma topic I'll be covering is the Five Skandhas, also known as the Five Aggregates. These are form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are the five aggregates that make up who we are, or rather who we conceive ourselves to be. These five skandhas are constantly playing out in our lived experience. As I've learned from studying them, the key is whether or not we are clinging to them. Galen helped me decide on talking about the five skandhas when I shared with her that growing up, my dad taught me a great deal about what things are made up of, how they work, and how they were constructed. I enthusiastically took on a fascination with the constructs of the world, and this fascination has helped me to keep an inquisitive and fresh perspective, even when the world didn't seem to make sense. The five skandhas in Buddhism have always been a very useful way of understanding how such a thing as a person can exist. From the beginning of my studies, I connected with this aspect of Buddhism, which I found very direct and demystifying when it comes to understanding the way things are and the way things have been constructed. Another aspect of my upbringing, which greatly contributed to my openness to the way, this way, was my mother's acceptance and encouragement of my novel pursuits at living in this world creatively and growing into being an artist. I'm very grateful to the profoundly different ways both my parents have loved me, taught me, and supported me. I grew up attending the First Unitarian Universalist Church, presided over by the Reverend Bob Shibley. Many years ago, Bob was one of the founding members of the group that eventually grew to be our Sangha. I remember Bob's radiant smile beaming down on me as a child. I can confidently say, sitting here now, I can feel the warmth and love he conveyed simply by welcoming us into the sanctuary, children and adults alike. It was a great smile. Powerful smile. It was partially my spiritual life being around Bob and being involved in the Unitarian Church, supported by both of my parents, that acted as a pointer towards meditation and Zen, when later in life I decided to get serious about my own spiritual journey. As we get into the skandhas, I'd like to share something from Dogen's fascicle that was encouraging to me while preparing for this talk. It reads, "To study the way of old Buddhas is to realize the way of old Buddhas. Generations and generations of old Buddhas. To study the way of old Buddhas is to realize the way of old Buddhas. Generations and generations of old Buddhas." Okay, not again. I have found that studying and preparing has been a practice in itself. Here is another quote from the fascicle that may be encouraging. It is as Swan Shah said, "Even if we look in the entire world for a single person who understands Buddha Dharma, it is impossible to find one." It is as Swan Shah said, "Even if we look in the entire world for a single person who understands Buddha Dharma, it is impossible to find one. Reverend, what do you call it?" Addressing the skandhas, let's first talk about the prevailing characteristic of all of them, which is change. All of the five skandhas are subject to change and are in fact constantly changing all of the time. For example, this platform, the form of this platform is constantly changing. Though it may not be apparent, the wood and the joints that make up this form are breaking down right now. This illustrates the first skandha, form. This is true for our own bodies as well. While we can use them for now, and in a way they seem permanent, the form of this platform and this body are not at all permanent. It is forgetting that which can lead to suffering. So this is important to recognize and remember, because it's true for all conceived forms. When we imagine and believe that things are real in the way that we think they are real, and then this turns out not to be the case, we suffer. This is why the five skandhas are important to learn about, because they are the building blocks of our experienced reality, which may not be real in the way we tend to think it is. Form can be described as anything that a sense can reach, anything that can be made contact with by the six senses. So form is anything that we can see, touch, smell, see, touch, smell, taste, hear, or encounter with the mind. In Buddhism, the mind is considered a sense faculty. That leads us to feeling. Form and feeling happen very quickly in our experience. They simply occur for sentient beings without us trying. Bhikkhu Bodhi writes in the Noble Eightfold Path, the feeling may not be clearly registered, but in subtle ways, the feelings may not be clearly registered, but in subtle ways they nourish and sustain the dispositions to unwholesome states. Thus, when a pleasant feeling arises, we fall under the influence of defilement, greed, and cling to it. When a painful feeling occurs, we respond with displeasure, hate, and fear, which are aspects of aversion. And when a neutral feeling occurs, we respond, we generally do not notice it, or let it lull us into a false sense of security, states of mind governed by delusion. Sounds fun, right? I'll read the quote again. Above, Bhikkhu Bodhi is illustrating that feelings fall into three categories: positive, negative, or neutral. The feelings may not be clearly registered, but in subtle ways, they nourish and sustain the dispositions to unwholesome states. Thus, when a pleasant feeling arises, we fall under the influence of the defilement, greed, and cling to it. When a painful feeling occurs, we respond with displeasure, hate, and fear, which are aspects of aversion. And when a neutral feeling occurs, we generally do not notice it or let it lull us into a false sense of security, states of mind governed by delusion. This illustrates how we are so prone to the slippery slope of greed, hate, and delusion. Something is pleasant, why not chase after more of it? Well, as I think we all know, there can be reasons. So we only have two skandhas, but we are already finding that we can interact and manipulate things in ways that can get us into trouble, while all five skandhas are always at play together. So while the raw forms and feelings can seem like things that are simply happening without our doing anything, and that would be pretty accurate, what are the other elements that are in turn interacting with all these forms and sensory feelings? I'll get to my story soon. Immediately following feeling is the third skandha, perception. Perception is the labeling and naming of what we are feeling and sensing. When our eyes sense directly some illumination through these windows, we label that as light from the sun, or we label the objects we see out the window. street, tree, fence, etc. This all happens very quickly, and it's happening all of the time. Rather than simply allowing the shapes, the lights and darks to exist, our brains constantly analyze and identify. This is very useful, of course. You want to see if a branch is either near or far so that you don't run into it, right? Near and far, these are examples of perceptions. But our perceptions are not always accurate, and our perceptions can even fool us. A classic example in Buddhism is mistaking a stick for a snake. It's an example of how our perceptions can lead us astray. The ability to name and label things is important, but it's when we lose track of whether our perceptions are real or not that we can get lost. I think it's as simple as mistaking the perception itself for the reality the perception is trying to grasp. Each one of us sees the image out the window, but which one sees the real thing? This teaching points out that our perceptions are only our way of labeling what it is we are seeing. Our perceptions are not actually what we are seeing. Onward with my story. As I grew up and grew into being my own person, as we all do, I thought, this is quite a segue, I thought I was a pretty good person. I thought I was a good person, okay? Not that I'm not, but perhaps I thought that I was a better person than I really was, maybe around 18, 25. In my life, 2 occasions that seemed to propel me deeper into practice by way of suffering were 2 romantic relationships and how they fell apart. I won't go into much detail, but in the first of the 2, when we broke up, I realized that I really didn't care about other people and their input as much as I wanted to, and this didn't match with the image I had of myself. I thought I was a really great guy. But perhaps the high regard with which I held myself was beginning to eclipse how I valued others. I realized that reality was showing me that my perceptions of myself weren't quite accurate, and I was losing a relationship with someone I loved because of it, partially. I'm adding stuff. Okay. Stick to the script. So I changed. I began to keep a small notebook in which I would write down recommendations and information people would share with me. I began to listen and value what other people said more, and it was very fulfilling. I remember my ex at the time saying that I had changed, but that relationship had changed too, and there was no way we could stay together, so I moved on. It was around this time that I was beginning to meditate also. Something told me that it was time to begin my spiritual journey, and I'm very grateful for that something. So briefly, this illustrates how the skandhas are at play. My life, my experiences, are culminating in me in beliefs and ways of seeing myself. These are called mental formations, the 4th skandha. It is also translated as volition or will. All of the forms, feelings, and perceptions I experienced were building into a self-image that was pleasing to me. Based on my upbringing, ideas from the church, etc., I formed ideas about myself, making mental formations that I sought to reify by my actions. The experiences this form had were manifesting in acts of will, both of thought and action. Not that any of this is bad, but is it all based on sound foundations? I'm building something quite solid on the foundation of the 5 skandhas, which are constantly changing. The 4th skandha of mental formations seems to get very jumbled and complicated quickly, as we are always cobbling together all of our experiences and actively trying to make sense of things. It seems understandable that we would want to see things as solid and unchanging as an essential part of this process, doesn't it? Even my solution, which was to take actions to better align myself with my self-image as a good person, didn't really address the root cause of all of this construction of self-image in the first place. And how good of an idea is it to be constantly building such a thing? And this next part's very important. But I was doing the best I could with what I knew. As Galen Roshi reminded me, I am not really the one who created all of these notions anyways. They were built by my surroundings, my upbringing, countless factors. This points towards the truth of no self. Everything is connected, and nothing is entirely self-sufficient. Dogen's fascicle, Old Buddha Mind, also addressed this using walls as an example. What are so-called walls? What are called walls? What shape are they? Does making cause walls to appear? Do walls cause making to appear? Are walls made or not? Do they or do not they emerge right here? I'll read it again. So what are so-called walls? What are called walls? What shape are they? Does making cause walls to appear? Do walls cause making to appear? Are walls made or not? Do they or do they not emerge right here? Dogen's questions turn us around and around a few times and help us question some of the assumptions we may hold as obvious. I found in my studying of Zazen, I felt like I was spinning. I was like, how can I talk about something that comes from just the feeling of spinning like a top? But it was also very, brought me into the present moment in a nice way. Because when you're spinning like a top, it's like, just spin. How this applies to my story is that when we broke up, all of the mental formations which I held as quite real began to collapse. Let's see how we get there. That was very painful because I felt that I had done everything right, and that wasn't being reflected by reality. When I looked clearly at myself then, I didn't much like what I saw. I had been so preoccupied with enjoying my own creation that I had missed something real, and that is what other people had to offer. I hope it makes sense how clinging to the skandhas played into that. Perhaps if I had been more informed about the Dharma, I would have been able to notice and then question my own lofty opinion of myself, or at least have been able to take it a little less seriously and seen it as a little less real. This is the gift of all of this. It is much easier not to hold on so tightly to all of these illusory creations and mental formations all the time. They bog us down so much. When we realize that things aren't quite as solid and real as we think they are, it can be very liberating. And believe me, with the practice, you don't lose all of the formations you have accumulated. Just maybe hold them less tightly. So to wrap up the fourth skandha, mental formations follow perceptions and are the stories and concepts that are created and we hold on to about everything. We are constantly thinking about things and building structures with which to understand things. And these are all mental formations. Again, they aren't bad. And these aren't things that we want to destroy. It's just that we want to see them clearly for what they are. If we can hold things less tightly, we will be able to see them for what they are, and they may have less control over us. That can make a huge difference. These are ways that our tiny little existence is trying to make sense of something unfathomable as all existence. Yet, it gets us into trouble, but it deserves compassion, limitless compassion. Being too hard on ourselves and thinking that will help is just another mental formation. We can't escape it, so let's breathe with it. I want to mention here one of the values of meditation. When we practice Zazen, we build the capacity to be with ourselves. All our feelings and thinking and forming. It is building this capacity to witness all of this that gives us some space to be able to not identify with everything so much, to not cling to things so hard. I sit zazen regularly here in the mornings, and I find that on days that I meditate, I feel that I have more agency in my own life. I may not be able to control whether I have a good day or a bad day, but I do feel that I have more capacity to notice everything and more of an option not to identify with and be lost in what is going on inside and outside. It's a work in progress. That increases the chances it will be a good day, by the way, the practice. Meditation gives us the option to see things as they really are. Now I will share another experience that really propelled me deeper. Upon the dissolution of the second romantic relationship I want to share about today, I began to suffer more deeply than I had ever suffered in my entire life. I originally wrote some details about how bad it was, but I think I'll just say, trust me, it was bad. The wake-up call of this experience, and then I talk about it, is that after we broke up, I felt as if the ground of my mental stability had completely given out beneath me. When I began to feel this deep pain, I didn't want to escape. I wanted to figure out how I got into so much trouble. Some of my methods were decidedly ill-advised, though, such as isolation. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't recommend isolation at times of crisis for anyone, by the way. I did continue to meditate, learn, and seek on my spiritual journey, though. And this is why I can look back on all of this as a learning experience. At that time, I was suffering much, much more than I had ever imagined I would in my entire life. It's a big surprise. I suppose, along with believing that I was a good person, I also believed that I was a pretty stable person. Accepting how much I was struggling would have been enough of a challenge on its own. But I was struggling to do that and also get through my day-to-day life. I have learned over time that fighting reality does not help. My reality was that I had lost a mental stability that I thought I would never lose. Perhaps it was the Dharma that compelled me to not try to escape this reality, but to continue forward with the goal of realizing what had happened that had led to this collapse, because I had no idea. I remember talking to friends, and they encouraged me that time heals all wounds, and that I would meet someone else. But even though ultimately they were right, I felt that they didn't understand. I didn't want to heal and jump on the merry-go-round again. I wanted to learn a lesson that to me was very obviously presenting itself through all this pain and mental anguish. It's hard to explain how practicing and learning about the Dharma supported that, but I certainly wasn't being encouraged to hop on any merry-go-rounds. I was accepted as I was at my practice places. The 2 temples I practiced at over these years were safe spaces for me that spoke about suffering in a way that I connected with. The transformation and healing is ongoing, and it has taken place over more than a decade. I remember at the beginning of my spiritual journey, over 15 years ago, I would take 3 deep mindful breaths every day. I didn't have a Sangha or good meditation instructions yet, but I remember the relief those 3 breaths brought to this day. I experienced a formative connection here at the center during that time, about 10 years ago. One day I was here for Zazen in the afternoon, as I was many afternoons. and Yazan Dave Johnson saw me. I suppose he could tell that I was struggling and offered to chat. We had a meeting on the front porch right here, and while some were sitting zazen just inside, something about our conversation had me overcome with such cathartic emotion. I was crying and laughing at the same time. It was very special. And later on, Dave became my mentor and shared a great deal with me all the way up until his death. I am forever grateful to have been lucky enough to have forged such a connection with him and his wife Luann during that time. Dave collaborated with Gyōun to give me my Dharma name, Wandering Cloud. Very happy about it. During this time, when everything was really deeply transforming for me, I had begun practicing in earnest here at the center. In a way, practicing here kind of matched with my ideas of being a good person. But thankfully, after practicing for a while, I either am actually a good person or I have somewhat loosened my grip on the idea that I am any one thing at all. I also practiced at another temple called Universal Door Meditation Center under the teacher Thich Dieu Tien, off and on over these last 10 years. That's in Sugar Land. It's in a Vietnamese tradition. I want to extend my gratitude to her as well. I was there mostly from 2014 to 2019. I was even set to ordain at one point and completed a 7-month trial ordination period where I mostly lived at the temple in Sugar Land. Ultimately, I wasn't ready to ordain there. I remember joking with my teacher there years later that living at the temple had been harder than living with myself, alone in all that suffering. we were all laughing. But my experience during the trial ordination was certainly transformative. I don't regret it. And it propelled me forward with a dedication to keep practicing as a lay practitioner. I promised myself I would continue practicing because I had no doubt that this was the path for me. I learned that it doesn't have to be this high intensity level of practice. For some people, myself included, this type of effort isn't really a good fit for us because we can burn out. So I've tried to be careful with my practice so that I can continue on year after year and hopefully build capacity. The Sangha here at Houston Zen Center is very much in line with this careful encouragement to practice. I find that the practice here closely aligns with the middle way that avoids extremes, and that is a saving grace. So I feel that I'm getting away from the skandhas as they go on. So let's tackle consciousness. Consciousness is the 5th skandha. It's odd. Being a conscious person, you would think it would be as simple to define consciousness. But I found it to be a challenge, even with the help of the study material. Well, awareness is an aspect of consciousness. I read also that consciousness is one thing that continues on from life to life. In talking with Gyōun, she pointed out that consciousness is often flavored one way or another, and it can have wholesome and unwholesome aspects. One way that it has occurred to me to describe consciousness is to think of it as a canvas. It is the basic awareness that contains a constantly changing painting. Consciousness arises in unison with the constant flux of our experience and is informed and colored by all of our past experiences, mental formations, perceptions. Even our bodies have a consciousness and react to stimuli instinctually. While mental formations are more akin to objects that we can take to be solid, even if they're thoughts, consciousness must reckon that with the very unsolid nature of experience. So if we are feeling downtrodden because things aren't going our way, our consciousness is being colored by this sadness, and everything on the canvas has a twinge of sadness. Even though awareness is essential to consciousness, and awareness itself is quite pure, filters are constantly being overlaid on top of it, being greatly affected by many things. It can be in rapture, or it can be in the zone, working on something we are passionate about. And again, is this experience of consciousness the experience of a separate self? Or is consciousness the experience of the universe experiencing itself? With the second vision, the canvas maybe could transform into a mirror, able to reflect anything, but holding on to nothing. Consciousness is also emptiness. A quote I like that may be helpful in illustrating the different ways consciousness can be thought of is from a sutra we chant here called the Genjo Koan. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. Again, the quote is, to carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So while we may wish that we had all of the answers and knew what was coming, that simply isn't the way it works. We can either cling to these 5 skandhas, or we can see them and experience them for what they are, the factors that make up a person. This person. Does this person have to be a separate self that owns and carries all that it contains? Or can it be a free and ever-changing expression of everything, all of the time? That's not to say that it's easy to transform. A key for me has been a lot of patience and belief that it's possible, even with baby steps. It's very helpful too. And this is not something that you have to do alone. I'm still very much learning that. The Sangha here is here to support each member, and the people here are willing to help more than you may realize. But it's a challenge because, at least for me, asking for help in my times of greatest weakness is one of the hardest things to do, sadly. So we must have compassion and understanding for ourselves every step of the way. This translates to compassion and understanding for others, by the way. I hope that what I have shared has been helpful, and I look forward to continuing to practice with you all in many different ways.